They had been celebrating a promise, a new wing, a scholarship endowment, a name on a plaque that would gleam for decades. Long Oak Preparatory's gala that night smelled of perfume and polished wood. The chandeliers threw soft halos over a crowd used to being seen. The donor of the evening, Alexandra Voss, late model dress, a voice that could cut through a room because everyone listened, took the stage with the smile of someone accustomed to applause. The band played a tune suited for fundraisers, for toasts, for photographs that would live in the school's annual report. At the back of the hall, beneath the heavy drape that hid the supply closet and the janitorial closet, Bernard Kellerman wiped a smudge off a brass plaque. The light from the hall fell on his forearms, on the calluses that came from pushing carts and unclogging sinks, on a wedding band that had long lost its shine. He wore the school's faded polo like a uniform of invisibility. He worked nights. He cleaned the day's traces, and he knew the names of everyone who spilled coffee on the library carpet, but hardly anyone knew his. When the donor's speech faltered, the room assumed it was an awkward pause. People shifted in their seats. Alexander's hand reached for the podium and did not come away. Then the microphones captured the sound that reshaped everything, a small, terrifying rattle, the intake of someone who had suddenly been denied breath. Her face went slack. The halo of the chandelier blurred. Bernard was 2 steps away. He had been at the back of the room a heartbeat before, and now he was at the foot of the stage. He had been trained once years before, a brief session at a community center, a note card tucked into a sock, call for help, compress. He did not think of training. He thought only of a child he loved, of Molly's small hands searching his for comfort, of how a life could be measured by a single inhalation. He knelt. The sound of the crowd broke into a dozen frenzied noises. Someone shouted for medics. A woman in pearls pushed past. Cameras blinked on. Bernard's hands found the donor's chest, pressed with the rhythm that had not lived in him, but felt like an answer to a prayer. Those in the room watched a janitor's hands move on the donor's body, hands that could polish trophies, but that suddenly were shaping air back into lungs. He worked until the EMS team arrived. He kept his palms to her sternum until the professionals took over, until they thanked him in clipped tones and pulled her into the corridor lined with fluorescent light. He answered the question succinctly. I called 911. I stayed with her. I kept compressions. He tried to step back into the crowd. His shirt still smelled faintly of bleach. He expected some gratitude. Instead, he found a stare that was colder than the polished brass.
A security lead, a man in a dark suit whose badge read Facilities Liaison, as if the title meant the person could manage reality, stepped forward and barked questions in a tone that made the hem of Bernard's shirt itch. He had not been part of the honoree list. He had not been squeaky clean in the way wealthy people expect. The conversations in the hall shifted like weather. Someone said, sotto voce, he's not supposed to be there. Another person, with a phone already tilted up and recording, framed Bernard in the lens like a specimen. A whispered rumor started. He was too close. By the time the ambulance doors closed behind the donor, an HR representative had appeared, a terse woman with a folder. The lead security and the head of development, a glossy man named Tyler Brigham, a school administrator who had learned early which versions of the truth were convenient, exchanged looks. Tyler's jaw made a small, decisive movement. We can't have him here, Tyler said to the HR woman. He spoke as if he were adjusting lighting. For the optics, for the donors. We will have to ask him to leave. For good. Bernard, who had expected a handshake, heard the phrase and felt something in his stomach drop into a place no one could reach. Sir, he said. His voice was plain. I saved her. I did CPR. There was a pause, the kind that collects small truths and lets them gather dust. This is a serious allegation, the HR woman said, her tone a scalpel wrapped in velvet. Bernard tried to explain the mechanics of the night. He had been straightening chairs and refilling napkin dispensers when the sound came. He had not seen anything else. He had not done anything but press until professionals arrived. He kept his hands on his thighs as if they might be accused of steering some additional narrative. At the office the next morning, Bernard's supervisor signed a sheet and slid it across the desk. It was a termination letter dressed in corporate grammar. Separation of employment, effective immediately, no severance due to cause. Someone had checked a box that made eviction follow detention. Bernard's keycard was deactivated as if his presence were contagious. The custodial closet smelled the same the day he packed a faded lunchbox. Lemon cleaner, the memory of repair. Molly poked her head into his world with curiosity and a small backpack. She did not understand why Daddy's name had disappeared from the payroll wall. She only asked one question often. Will we still have pancakes tomorrow? Bernard, who had been steady for 28 years, summed up for a child what the word fear felt like without using it. They were given a single paycheck that had been wired to a bank account the previous week. They had no severance.
That night, Bernard watched Molly sleep on a couch that was a little more threadbare than usual. The living room light tuned low so she would not see the worry that made his hands tremble. He held her smaller hand in the dark and did not let the fear show. He had always made her pancakes. The board meeting's footage, downloaded and clipped, made its way out into the less filtered streams. A phone camera's frame, shaky and close, cut into more composed angles. A still image froze Bernard's face over Alexandra's chest. Someone added a caption. Caught on cam, janitor gets handsy with donor. The text spread like a stain. Within hours, the message threads began. Former colleagues sent hesitant notes. A recruiter rescinded a call. A neighbor crossed the street when he saw Bernard coming down the block. Tyler's memo, framed as concern for the school's reputation, landed in every trustee's inbox. We must act decisively. The community will judge us by our response. The memo did not mention that Bernard had sustained compressions until EMS arrived. The memo mentioned optics. Bernard experienced the smear as if it were weather. At first it was rain, got rinsed off. Then it became something colder, a sleet that crept under the collar and found bone. People he had cleaned for all his adult life now looked at him as if he had been inked with accusation. He applied for work and was met with polite phone calls that ended in silence. He asked for references and was told we are restructuring. It was a slow, methodical dismantling. The landlord left a notice in the mailbox, small and firm. A plug-in on the kitchen stove clicked twice and failed. The recycling bin was returned to the curb with a brochure for a soup kitchen tucked inside. Molly's classroom mothers whispered, and one child came home with a question. Why did the lady cry when you left, Daddy? The question moved through Bernard like a new kind of ache. He had other things to balance besides bills. He kept a folder with his daughter's immunization records, a stack of utility bills, and an old photo of a woman whose laugh was now only in Bernard's memory. He adjusted his schedule to stretch the paychecks. He took on small day jobs when he could find them. A church basement cleaning, a weekend repaint. Employers asked him to take gap shifts, to prove himself, to demonstrate a cleanliness beyond the world's moral panic. Meanwhile, the woman who had almost died woke in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and expensive linen. Alexandra Voss opened her eyes to a ceiling that had been trimmed in calming blue paint, to a nurse who talked to her in a tone of practiced hope. She had faint recollections of applause, of a face bending over her as if a hand might find breath. The memory was glimmered and fogged. It did not resolve. The hospital kept footage of the event. It was protocol, someone told her later. A few hallway cameras, the stage feed, the security tapes, all archived.
Alexandra, with a bruise of confusion on her memory, asked if someone could show her the recordings. She did not expect the video to look like what it had been to her. The camera's point of view was unforgiving. It captured the plainness of Bernard's shirt, the quickness of his motion, the compression of his hands. It caught the hands of the janitor in motion, the only hands that had done what needed doing. When she watched, the film resolved into fact. Her body remembered nothing until the footage put breath back into the picture. She saw the moment a stranger placed himself between death and her, and the image destabilized something in her chest that had been built on distance and control. A memory reassembled under the light, a man who had been background, suddenly in the foreground. But if the footage cleared Bernard for anyone who watched with eyes, it did not change the currents that had already been set. Tyler had been swift. Tyler had shaped the narrative into something manageable before the footage could be analyzed by anyone outside the inner circle. He had included a carefully worded press line, a list of talking points, and a plan for immediate removal of the alleged perpetrator. An institutional heartbeat had decided faster than mercy. Alexandra felt the pull of two forces at once. A social current that said the institution must never appear to tolerate impropriety, and an inexplicable moral tug to find the man who had kept her breathing. She lay back against the hospital pillow and watched the video again the next day. It showed nothing salacious. It showed with blunt clarity, hands steady against sternum, a tie askew, a janitor's breath that was full of the same human haste as everyone else's. "This is him," she told her nurse, and the nurse's face felt like a map to something she did not yet understand. "Who is he?" "We asked for his name," the nurse said. "They told us his name, but we were asked not to pursue it. It's complicated." Complicated, the way institutions call the simple shames of omission. Alexandra's public life was built on lines of complication: tax planning, trustee meetings, naming rights. To admit error was to knead weakness into a world where appearance was weight. But the footage did not accommodate weight. It demanded honesty. At home, Bernard closed himself in the bathroom and washed his hands until the skin on his fingers was rough. Water from the sink painted his arm with the kind of pattern a storm leaves on a window. He thought of the donor's hand, which had been cold and then warm like a small animal finding footing again. He thought of living on rice for 3 days, of counting the pennies in a jar. He thought of the smear and how quickly the crowd had turned. "You did what you were supposed to, Papa," Molly said one night, when she woke and found him on the couch. She propped her head on his shoulder as if she could mend where the world had torn. "You saved someone."
It was the simplest of truths, and the most dangerous. Truth existed quiet and small, and the world around it was loud and unkind. The smear took on a life of its own. Some videos cut footage with a cunning frame. The moment Bernard reached for the donor's chest, juxtaposed with a clip of a socialite sobbing on camera. Headlines sprouted online in a formation like mold. Donor uncomfortable, action taken, school moves quickly after incident. Tyler briefed the press, leaning into the narrative he'd crafted with the ease of someone arranging dishes on a table. He emphasized protocol. He emphasized that all steps were taken for the safety of our community. Out in the neighborhood, Janet Holloway, who had lived 3 doors down from Bernard for a decade, and who had knocked on his apartment after her husband's funeral, and found in him a small kindness, watched him become smaller in public, and even smaller on payday. Janet had a habit of bringing casseroles and a blunt humor that could cut tension. She kept the spare keys to Bernard's mailbox, and sometimes handed him envelopes with work notice inside without comment. She watched him with a neighbor's love that did not demand return. "You did what you did because you're a good man," she told him over a chipped mug of coffee on a morning when the weight of his joblessness had turned his smile into a thin line. "We know that. Others will see eventually." "Others?" Bernard asked. He had stopped trusting the future tense. "I know what I know." Janet tapped the table with her finger. She didn't say who had told her. The truth is that small towns and neighborhoods trade in truth like currency. On that day, the trade was in favor of hope. At a swipe of her phone, Alexandra discovered the word janitor on a comment thread that had been specially curated by a PR flack as filters and damage control. The distances between people who lived under domes of money and people who did not had somehow telescoped into her screen. A man who had saved her was now his country's pariah. She wanted to fix it. That was not how she had thought power worked. She had always used power to build edifices, to add rooms and scholarships and donor walls. Fixing a life was not in her pamphlets. Yet she found herself dialing numbers she never dialed in the night, requesting names, asking a 30-something assistant, Fiona Marcus, whose competence was stitched into Alexandra's staff like gold thread, to look up the janitor who performed CPR at the event. Fiona worked with a kind of quiet efficiency. She pulled security logs and cross-referenced staff records. Bernard Kellerman, she read back, the name a Midwestern role that sounded like a place than a person. He cleared to work nights, background checks clean, no history. Then why was he fired? Alexandra asked. Tyler pushed for immediate removal, she said. He flagged it as a donor safety concern before the footage could be fully reviewed.
It was handled as a liability. Alexandra did not want to hear that. She did not at first want to understand that expedience had chosen a scapegoat rather than the truth. But she had seen the footage. She could feel under her ribs the sensation of an unfairness that tasted like a metal coin left in sunlight. She called Tyler. The man answered in that tone of smooth control that had carried him through many boardroom skirmishes. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "how are you feeling?" "Confused," she said, "and unsettled." She kept her voice careful. "Why did you fire him?" "We did what was necessary," Tyler replied. "The donor felt unsafe. In those moments, you prioritize the person who's been affected." "You prioritized optics," Alexandra said. The words felt foreign in her mouth. Perhaps that was why they landed like small, precise stones. "We can discuss this further," Tyler said, "but for now, we need to protect the community." The call ended with Tyler promising to send a full accounting. The call also placed a damper on Alexandra's immediate need to act. It pushed the decision toward a formal process she neither trusted nor liked. Her instinct was to go where she had always gone, to solve things with money and presence. But the things money could fix did not always mend dignity. Bernard took the next days like a man carrying groceries in both hands, carefully, watching each step. He applied at stores that did not ask for references, but instead asked for a different kind of history. He lined up at a temp agency and waited as people behind him typed his name into search bars and tutted in disapproval. He found a job at a small carpet cleaning company for a week, hauling machines through basements that smelled of mildew and forgotten things. He told Molly the truth in small doses. "We're adjusting the budget, sweetie, because children absorb shame like hearing the wrong notes in a song." And under the pressure of being watched unwitnessed, Bernard's own body gave small signs of surrender. Nights became a series of coughing fits he could not place, mornings a set of vibrations at the base of his neck. He thought it was fatigue. He thought time had taken to draining him like a sink. At the school, the board framed their actions in terms of safeguarding donors and maintaining trust. They convened a closed meeting and issued a sanitized statement to the press. "Long Oak takes allegations seriously. We will cooperate fully with any investigation." The statement said nothing about a man who had kept a donor breathing. It instead erred on the side of institutional survival. But within those closed spaces, not everyone agreed. There were 2 trustees who felt a movement in their chests when they watched the footage, a call to honor the person who had labored without fanfare. They appealed quietly, asking for an internal review. The appeal was noted and then not acted upon with speed. Tyler moved faster.
He had a talent for rerouting moral trouble into logistical action. Alexandra sat one night in her study, the room trimmed in walnut, and that indefinable smell of someone who had been overseas too often. She rewatched the footage on a loop, as if truth might change in the watching. The image stilled sometimes. The camera's frame froze on Bernard's hands. Hands. She had always liked hands. Hands that traced notes on a ledger, hands that clasped young scholars in congratulatory gestures. But these hands were different. They were calloused and decisive. They had saved her. She felt an odd, immediate respect for a man she did not know. She felt a small, fierce guilt for what had been done in her name. It was not enough, though. She could not simply sign a check and expect the world to turn back into place. She had learned how to power the construction of a building. She had not learned how to write a life single-handedly when the machinery of optics was already rolling. Beyond the screens and the statements, Bernard's nights grew thinner. A collector's notice arrived, slipped into the mailbox with a postal smile, announcing a debt he could not meet. The local paper, sensing tension that makes for clicks, ran a short piece about the school's response. It did not quote the janitor. It had not sought him. One afternoon, as Bernard walked Molly to the corner bus stop, a woman scowled and crossed the street. The bus passed, and Molly clung closer to him, as if cold were outside and existed independently of temperature. At home, a bailiff note had been pressed through their door, utilities to be cut if the bill remained unpaid. The world had become a series of doors that kept closing and locks clicking into place. Alexandra placed a call to the hospital's records office and asked again for help. The woman on the line asked for her patient number and then paused, the kind of pause that contains a lot of small procedural languages. "We can release footage in the scope of an investigation," the woman said, "but it belongs to the institution." "I want to know who that man is," Alexandra said. "Please, I want to find him." Fiona, who had been running down logs and database entries, sent Alexandra a name and a last known address. The address was a small, unadorned apartment building on a side street, a place that fit the story of someone who was always seen by the work they left rather than the life they led. Alexandra looked at the coordinates and felt suddenly both powerful and powerless. The map was a thin rectangle on a screen, but it was the first place where the man had a real-world anchor. She switched off her phone and stared at a photograph of the donor wall she had commissioned, the engraved names reflecting light like small altars. Her life had been built around roofs and walls and the ways names shimmer on them. Now she felt the pressure of a name that had not been on any wall. Bernard Kellerman. She thought of going alone, of showing up at his apartment with a check and an apology wrapped in ribbon. Instead, she did what she was trained to do when faced with messy things. She assembled the people whose métier was making things workable. She called Fiona, and she asked the assistant to coordinate a discreet approach. No press, no fuss, just a small, human correction. But institutions do not cede ground easily. Tyler, who had been listening in to parts of the ascent, after all, the donor was beloved by the board, felt the air change. He smelled danger. He convened his own list. "Control the narrative," he told a team of PR advisors. "We need to ensure that nothing undermines our donors' confidence." Within the same 24 hours, a rumor pivoted. A former volunteer at the Gala, someone with a grudge about being overlooked, added a slant to the tale that would make the smear stick like resin. Screenshots that never once showed the full context were remixed with comments that made Bernard's presence appear audacious, not heroic. The remixing was mercenary. It did not require truth. Bernard, unaware of the board's late-night maneuvers, did what he always did. He went to work in the small jobs that would pay cash. He had not told Molly about the precise nature of his days. He did not want to.
Children have a way of absorbing adult distress and making it their own. Molly began to ask questions about school lunches and about why they no longer had the magic nights where Daddy sat up late with pancakes and cartoons. One morning, after a night of coughing that had left him breathless and dizzy, Bernard woke and felt like his chest had been filled with a weight he could not name. The air seemed a little thinner, or his lungs a little less willing. He sat on the edge of the bed and noticed that the photograph on the dresser, Molly at age 5, blowing out candles, looked a distance away, as though covered in glass. He breathed and counted, 3 shallow inhales that were not enough. Across town, Alexandra sat in her kitchen, staring out a window at the school's facade and at a horizon that looked like a paper cutout. She called to her assistant, then paused. This was not about a building. It was about a person. She had the resources that could rebuild lives, not only rooms. She had the capacity to make a mistake right. In a narrow apartment that smelled of last night's coffee and lemon cleaner, Bernard stumbled to the sink and gripped the faucet. The cheap linoleum felt cold under his bare feet as he tried to steady himself. For a moment the apartment wavered like a mirage, the photograph on the dresser blurring to the edges. Molly slept through the noise of the city, unaware that her father was counting his breaths like beads. "Just a minute, kiddo," Bernard whispered to the photograph more than to himself.
He tried to pull air into his lungs in the way he had pulled it into Alexandra's when she had been on the stage. The technique rose in him like a memory. He felt dizzy. His fingers went white against the chrome. Down the hallway, Janet knocked and found the door unlocked, which was odd for Bernard. The foyer smelled of lemon cleaner and a thread of something metallic. She called, "Bernard?" The voice that answered was breathy, thin. Janet's hands moved with a speed born of an older domestic wariness. She pushed the door wider and saw Bernard in the kitchen, head bowed, hand against his chest. "Bernard," she said again, no longer a question. He tried to answer, to say he'd be fine, to insist that this was just exhaustion. The words crawled and sounded small. He slumped against the counter and reached for his jacket. Janet moved, old bones suddenly nimble. She called out for help downstairs, then dialed 911 with the practiced motions of someone who had seen too many summers. Across town, Alexandra's phone buzzed with Emily's text. The records office had forwarded a scanned image. Fiona had left a note, name and address verified. "I'll go with you if you want me to speak to him in person." Alexandra looked at the coordinates again. Her pulse quickened, not because of the logistics, but because she felt suddenly the presence of something fragile and human. She made a choice that had nothing to do with strategy. She would find Bernard Kellerman. She stood and pulled on a jacket, the fabric making a soft whisper, and told Fiona she would leave in 20 minutes. By the time Alexandra's car pulled away from her driveway, sirens were already singing a staccato rhythm a few blocks from Bernard's building. Janet was on the phone in a voice that leaned into commands older than city ordinances, and a paramedic was already easing a stiff, tired man onto a stretcher. Molly had been roused from sleep and was staring wide-eyed at the sight of masked faces and bright lights through the building's frosted glass. Bernard's world narrowed to a sequence of bright clinical reds and beeps, to the way hands touched him with purpose rather than suspicion. He felt himself becoming a thing that needed tending, which was both terrifying and strangely relieving. He thought for a moment of the night at the Gala, the pressure of connected palms, the small miracle of breath returned. He did not know as the ambulance doors shut and the fluorescent glare washed his features that the woman he had saved was on a road that would take her to his address. He did not know that a life of access and money was moving in a car towards the place his life had gathered in a series of cracked apartment tiles and a daughter's earnest questions. He did not know the larger gears that were shifting, one set on the side of damage control and another set turning toward accountability.
Outside, the night split into 2 bands, the institutional machinery of Tyler's insistence on control and the private, stumbling ethics of Alexandra's conscience. The two would converge, but not yet. For now, the story had moved from a single hall to the narrowness of an apartment and the wideness of a city street, and somewhere between those spaces, the truth had begun to stretch itself taut, waiting to be revealed. If this is gripping you and you want to see how it changes their lives, subscribe and keep following the story. Bernard was wheeled into the emergency bay beneath a glaring light that stole the color from everything. A nurse's hands checked him with the precise motions of people used to broken things. She listened to his chest and picked up an oxygen mask that he refused, then allowed it when a cough racked him into submission. Fragments of conversation skimmed the room like moths. Dehydration, exhaustion, monitor him. And yet none of the words could untangle the way his life felt like a butchered thread. Alexandra's car slowed at the corner where the streetlights threw long, somber shadows. She was not at the hospital yet, but the tides of her evening, the guilt, the footage, the sound of a body saved by another,
had become a call she could not ignore. Her driver idled as she stepped out, the night air filled with sirens that came and went like a chorus. She told the driver to follow and to keep discretion. Inside the hospital, Bernard lay under a sheet that smelled faintly of bleach. Molly clung to Janet's hand while the two of them sat in the corridor, a place where time was elastic and stretched thin by waiting. The monitors talked quietly in a language that kept him tethered to life. In a small waiting room that belonged to a world of linens and corporate benefactors, Alexandra stepped between plastic chairs and cardboard-filled boxes that served as a daily reminder of the institution she had helped to build. She had expected to see the man who had saved her, to offer an apology, a practical hand. Instead, she found herself watching the doors into the emergency room and wondering whether acknowledgement alone could smooth the way that had been set in motion by a hastily written memo. Her reflection in a glass panel looked like a person who had just been told a truth she had not expected to inherit, that favor and gratitude can be complicated when the machinery of reputation is involved. She thought of the plaques she had funded, the scholarships that had approved the school's status. She thought of how often she had not seen the people who kept the institution clean. Fiona arrived, carrying a small file. "I checked his address, Mrs. Voss," she said quietly. "It's him. He's been admitted." Alexandra's throat was dry. "Has he been identified as the man from the Gala?" Fiona vied. "Yes, they put the names together when he was admitted. They said the paramedics recognized him from the incident."
Alexandra's hands, which were used to handling contracts and checks, felt oddly useless. She could summon doctors, she could fund programs, she could call press conferences that would turn pain into polished statements. But she could not, with a signature, undo the way Bernard's life had frayed. In the room where Bernard lay, a monitor ticked in the background like a heartbeat of the world he had always worked to keep running. It was the same sound that had been steady for the donor that night, a mechanical echo of the breath he had helped reconstruct. The irony was not lost on him as the medic attached a clipboard. He had been a lifesaver who had become suspect. Janet squeezed Molly's shoulder with a proffer of a map to steadiness. "Sometimes people judge before they see," she said, "but sometimes they change." Bernard's eyelids fluttered as sweat cooled down his cheek. He thought of the Gala, of the hush that had fallen when the donor collapsed. He thought of the hands that had removed him from a room that had needed him. He thought, in a private, ragged way, of a child who needed pancakes, and a life that had become a ledger of small debts. Outside, in the colorless foyer of the hospital, Alexandra watched the doors that led into the emergency bay like a person who had never learned to wait with humility. She had always presumed to fix, to design, to instruct. This situation was not designed, it was messy. Tyler had sat in meetings and rearranged truth into a tidy conclusion. She had seen his memo. She had seen his priorities. She had seen his prudence. She had to decide whether to let such prudence stand unchallenged. She had not yet arrived at a resolution, but she felt the tilt of something inside her. The hands that had been steady in the footage were now surrounded by an apparatus of care. That was how life was supposed to be, recognized, tended. Instead, he had been shoved into an anonymity that protected the institution, but broke a man. Bernard coughed, the sound thin as paper. The nurse asked him for his name one more time. He told her with a voice like gravel, "Bernard Kellerman. I work nights. I have a daughter." A doctor jotted notes with a pen that made a dry sound against paper. Possible dehydration, exhaustion, monitor, social worker to follow. The entry was clinical and precise, but it could not contain the wider social ledger that had led Bernard to this bed. It could not note the look in Tyler's eyes when he had said, "for good," the way that phrase had slammed shut like a door. It could not note the hundreds of small nudges that had driven Bernard to the edge, lost shifts, rejected applications, the slow leaking of pride. At the same time, the door to Bernard's life was opening in another place. Alexandra had the map, the power, and the intention to follow it.
She sat in the waiting room and breathed, feeling the rumor and the video and the hospital's bleach taste mix into a resolve that felt at once abrupt and inevitable. She would help him, she told herself in the kind of internal speech that had built empires of plaques and scholarship funds. But helping was not a word that fit easily into the small, exact demands of dignity. It would require more than a check, more than a signed statement. It would demand standing against the soft cruelty that had expelled him, a public clearing of his name to remove the rot. Inside the emergency bay, Bernard's breath steadied in a way that made the beeps even and useful. He drifted in and out of sleep,
notes and fragments of voices landing like leaves around him. He held Molly's photograph close in his mind and found the small place where hope still existed, stubborn as a plant growing through a cracked sidewalk. Outside, Alexandra rose with a purpose that did not belong to a polished donor culture. She walked toward the nurse's station and asked where she could see Bernard Kellerman. The nurse looked at her as if she had asked for something, not an order. "You can be seated," the nurse said. "We'll let you know when he can receive visitors." Fiona touched Alexandra's sleeve and whispered, "I'll speak to social work. We have resources we can offer immediately." Her voice was a careful instrument. There would be consequences to the choices being made. There would be resistance and a structured humility from those who believed institutions were more important than individuals. But for the first time since the gala, something else shifted. The person who had been saved by invisible hands of a janitor had become visible enough to the person who had been saved to act. Bernard, in his thin hospital bed, drifted towards sleep with the city's muffled hum in his ears. Molly's face, in the photograph, looked like a patch of light. The monitor ticked. Outside, the city's night carried both a car that would bring power to a small apartment and an ambulance that had already taken breath back into a tired man. The scene was not neat. It was full of the jagged edges of chance and choice. And in the moment before the next move, before Tyler regrouped, and before Alexandra decided how loudly she would clear a name, the breath of the city seemed to hold, waiting. When Bernard opened his eyes again to the harsh hospital fluorescence, it was not the same disorientation as before. This time there was an odd clarity, like someone had peeled a thin film off the world. The beeps kept time. A clipboard rested against his knee. Somewhere beyond a sliding door, somebody laughed at a joke that did not reach him. Janet sat in the chair by his bed, hands folded over a paper cup that had gone cold. Molly slept in the crook of Janet's arm, her head heavy with the kind of sleep only children are granted after trauma. Her eyelids fluttered as if she were dreaming of pancakes.
A woman he had seen only on billboards and in glossy newsletters stood at the foot of the bed. Away from stages and spotlights, Alexandra Voss looked smaller and not at all like the idea of a donor. The hospital wrapper made her coat look too expensive for the fluorescent room. She held an envelope in both hands, as if it might tear. Fiona hovered at her shoulder, a file tucked under her arm like a talisman. The assistant's face was guarded and competent, the face of someone who could translate power into process. "Mr. Kellerman," Alexandra said, and the name moved like a small bell. I'm Alexandra Voss. She stopped, searching for what belonged beyond the polite clumsiness of a woman unused to apologizing. "I wanted to come and thank you." Bernard's voice was sand and gravel. "You don't need to thank me," he said. He had practiced the phrase like an old prayer. It was easier and truer than most of the statements that had been said about him. "No," Alexandra said, and the word arrived with a new weight. She walked closer and carefully, as if the space around him might be fragile, she placed the envelope on the bedside table. It was not a check, it was a typed note, simple, unsigned, and honest. "For immediate housing and medical needs, from Alexandra Voss, please accept help." Bernard looked at the paper and did not feel like a man being given something. He felt seen. The distinction mattered. It moved him in a way that money could not. "Everything will be taken care of while you recover," Fiona said quietly. "Temporary housing, medical follow-ups, immediate funds. We'll handle it discreetly." Bernard kept looking at Alexandra as the words tumbled into the air. The hospital's anesthetic gloom made her look ordinary and stricken at the same time. "Why would you do this?" he asked. "Because you were the person who put your hands on me when I could not breathe," Alexandra answered simply. "Because I watched the footage and it was clear. Because it shouldn't have been harder for someone who saved my life to be seen as anything but a lifesaver." She did not frame it as hero worship. She framed it as a correction. That was nearer to what Bernard needed. He wanted to refuse. He had swallowed pride before, at the landlord's door, at the temp agency's clipboard. Saying yes felt like admitting he needed mercy. But Molly's small, sleeping shoulder rose in a slow rhythm against Janet's arm, and the idea of turning down a roof felt absurd. He folded his hands and, in a voice that barely registered, said, "Thank you." The hospital social worker came in, a woman with gentleness stitched into her expression. She ran through the practicalities, follow-ups, referrals, a recommendation for a short course of outpatient care for the coughing and fatigue. She noted the usual things: housing insecurity, lack of insurance, and employment termination that would complicate benefits.
Each item was clinical on the forms, but between each line hung the human reality behind the codes. Alexandra listened and then listened again. When the social worker left, Alexandra asked, "What can I do that will make a difference beyond this room?" The question startled Fiona. "You could ensure a safeguarded fund for staff emergencies," she said slowly, thinking aloud. "Paid emergency leave, transitional housing, mental health support. Also a staff liaison role, someone who communicates between facilities workers and administration, so incidents aren't smoothed over as optics." Alexandra's face set into a look Bernard had seen on her at the gala, decision tucked into the jawline. "Yes," she said. "Do it. Start now." The next morning, the hospital released Bernard into temporary care arranged by Alexandra's people, a small furnished apartment near the school, keys left with Janet at a time when it would be safe for Bernard to arrive without cameras at the door. The apartment smelled faintly of citrus and rented upholstery. Molly launched into the cardboard boxes with the exhilarating ease of a child who believes that a new mattress might mean forever. Bernard accepted the bedding and the toiletries with a gratitude he could not fully voice. Word, however, refused to stay still. Tyler Brigham did not sleep the way a man with a narrative to control can be said to sleep. In the hours while Bernard lay tethered to monitors, Tyler convened the board's quiet members. He composed a counterline to Alexandra's instincts, a reminder that donors were fickle, that reputation was currency, that an institution cannot survive chaotic displays of contrition without purchasing a brand new narrative. He pushed for the school to appear firm, concise. He instructed the communications director to release a short statement emphasizing process and protocols. When Alexandra announced that she wanted the school to publicly clear Bernard and to found the staff program, Tyler's mouth set in a way Bernard would later recall as the moment he had become a target for retribution. "We risk setting precedent," Tyler said privately, to a trustee who leaned towards caution. "We risk encouraging improper access. The board must be cautious." "You mean you risk losing control," Alexandra replied. "We risk doing nothing and losing our humanity. That is the decision you are making." Alexandra did not shout. She did not need to. Her voice pressed against Tyler's argument like a pack against a leak. She also made clear, in a manner that had practical teeth, that the school's future naming gifts would be contingent on immediate policy reforms and transparent review. It was not a threat so much as a vector, money moving towards accountability. That night, the carefully curated world of social feeds and private messages erupted again. A short clip, an edited looping cut, appeared on a popular local account. It suggested that Bernard's reach had been inappropriate.
People wrote furious comments. The clip repurposed a panicked frame and dressed it with a caption that required no facts to be powerful. Tyler's circle shared the clip with donors who wanted to know the school was on it. Fiona noticed the clip before the news outlets did. She pulled it up, squinted, and felt something she described later as a cold drop on the back of her neck. The edits in the video were a dishonest cropping of the true footage. She forwarded the uncut camera feeds to Alexandra and to a trustee ally. "This is not the whole story," she wrote. "They've made a narrative out of a moment." Alexandra watched the uncut footage and felt, in a place she had rarely acknowledged, a pulse of shame for how quickly a group had moved to protect itself by expelling a person. She called the school's press office and told them to prepare a statement. Tyler, who had been told of the move, went into overdrive. He arranged a separate memo accusing Alexandra of making hasty decisions. It was a strategic, diplomatic attempt to split the board. The trustees split. A small group, led by two members who had always held a particular fondness for the school's maintenance staff, remembrances of their own blue-collar parents, pushed publicly for full transparency and for immediate reinstatement. Tyler pushed back, arguing firmly for investigations and procedural timelines. "I saved her life," Bernard said to Janet that week, the words falling in his lap like small pebbles. He had not meant them to be angry. They were a fact. His voice did not shake when he said them. The exhaustion had taken that resource from him. "I did what I had to." "You did what anyone would do," Janet told him. "It's just that not everyone gets watched for it." Molly warmed to the temporary apartment as if it had always been a home. She arranged a stuffed bear in the middle of the floor and declared Pancake Sunday's return. For the first time in months, Bernard let himself imagine small futures. A class trip paid for, a jacket that would not thread at the cuffs, a phone bill that would be made on time. But the pressure of being watched and unmoored wore at him. He had frank, angry nights where he would stare at the ceiling and feel the cruelty of a world that could not see his hands with suspicion. He sometimes rose in the middle of the night and paced the narrow kitchen,
running the same arguments backwards like cards. Alexandra made good on her initial offers. In a quiet, unscented meeting room, she signed aid measures, immediate funding for the Visible Hands Initiative, a pilot program earmarked for emergency pay, transitional housing, and a staff liaison role that would be jointly overseen by a staff-elected committee in the board. The fund was small enough to be feasible, and large enough to make quick, visible differences. It came with a pledge to audit staff grievances and to institute mandatory bystander awareness training that privileged dignity over optics.
Fiona began the practical work, compiling a list of staff members who might have been too afraid to speak up, arranging discreet interviews, sketching out a structure for emergency leave that did not require HR approval in the middle of a crisis. She also insisted on a transparency clause, documentation of policy decisions, a public annual report of staff incidents and responses. Institutions hide under process, she told Alexandra. If we make the process visible, we make it accountable. Tyler pushed back in predictable ways. He circulated a quiet dossier to a sympathetic trustee, a file containing an old, innocuous incident report from Bernard's distant past, an argument at a summer job years ago that had been documented as unprofessional conduct. Tyler framed it as evidence of a pattern, a narrative of risk he wanted the board to accept. It was a small, tactical attempt to muddy the waters. Alexandra asked to see the file. When she did, she read it in a small office while the rain began to tap the windows. The incident was petty and contextless, a teenage spat that had been escalated by a supervisor who had since retired. When Fiona dug into it, the report dissolved into bureaucratic noise. No criminal record, no accusation beyond a supervisor's annoyance. "That's not a pattern," Fiona said, in a voice that had lost patience for political games. Alexandra did not waste time on theatrics. She called the trustees back into a special meeting. She laid the unedited footage on the table. She showed Fiona's initial recommendations. She did not aim at drama, she aimed at accountability. "We either own this, all of it, or we continue to hide behind the idea that institutions must be preserved before people," she said. "I will not fund preservation at the expense of dignity." Her ultimatum moved the discussion from the realm of the hypothetical to the practical. Several major donors who had previously dithered found that they could no longer financially support a board that would protect reputations over people. That fact, money attached to ethical insistence, was what it took in many institutions for the decision to shift. Confronted with a new wave of pressure, Tyler attempted one last pivot. He leaked a selective summary of a trustee's private email in which the trustee had expressed concern about donor confidence. The leak was anonymous and malicious in its timing. It landed like a stone into the pond, rippling outrage among parents who feared instability. The press picked up on the leak and ran a piece about donor anxiety. Alexandra answered the leak with a different kind of pressure. She arranged a live panel at the school auditorium, open to parents and staff, where trustees would speak plainly about the incident and the reforms. It was, in many ways, a public gamble.
But she insisted the truth should be on the table. The uncut footage, an explanation of the process that had led to Bernard's firing, and a plan for structural change. She invited Bernard to be there. On the night of the panel, the auditorium hummed. The seats filled with parents, custodial staff, teachers, and at the far edges, trustees who had once sat in silence. Tyler sat stiff in a back row, his suit a shade too dark for the bright lights. Cameras rested on tripods. Someone in a press pool took notes. The school's banners reflected the house light like patient mirrors. Bernard arrived with Janet at his side, and Molly's small hand in his. He almost declined, until Fiona, with a look that was a mixture of insistence and deference, pulled him aside and said, "You can speak if you want. You don't have to, but you should know, people will listen." When his name was called, the room quieted in a way that surprised him. He stood at the microphone, the kind usually used for valedictories in choir soloists. He kept his voice low but clear. "I'm not a speaker," he began. "I've always been the one who cleans up other people's things. Tonight, I'll try to be plain." He looked at Alex, at the trustees, at the rows of faces. "I did what anyone might do when someone doesn't have enough breath. I was not there to be seen. I was just there to do the work I'd been taught to do." He paused. He felt Molly's fingers around his wrist, the small anchor of muscle and warmth. "But after that night, I lost work. I lost the place where I felt like I had value. People started to look at me differently. That was the hardest part. Not the money, but the way my hands were seen as suspicious." No one applauded. When he said simply, "I have a daughter," several people looked down at the floor. It was a line everyone understood. Alexandra stepped up after him, not to correct but to amplify. She spoke as one who had the power to do things and the humility to use it.
"We are creating an emergency fund for staff," she said. "We will create a liaison role and revamp policy so that people who care for our students are not rendered invisible. And today, publicly, I clear Bernard Kellerman's name. He saved my life. That is what happened." She placed a printed statement on the podium and left a copy with Bernard. The statement was concise, factual, and carried with it the weight of someone who had access to money and influence. It did not erase pain, but it performed a symbolic act that mattered. It put the institution on record as having acknowledged a wrong and taken steps to correct it. Tyler's protests, quiet and procedural, were drowned out by the sound of parents who had come expecting a sanitized memo and instead heard a man tell plainly what had happened. Several trustees stood and affirmed the plan. The room did not explode into perfection.
The conversation that followed was messy and honest, with parents questioning whether they had seen their own biases, with staff describing moments when they'd felt invisible. In the weeks after the panel, the Visible Hands Initiative rolled out its first measures. There were immediate, practical impacts. A staff member, who was a single mother of 3 and who had been days away from eviction, received a short stipend that kept electricity on and provided childcare while she arranged a more stable plan. A bus driver, who had saved a child from an accident on a rainy morning, was given paid leave while his car was repaired. The school published an annual report detailing incidents and reforms, and it created a small internal oversight committee composed of staff and trustees. Bernard, who had resisted the idea of being aided on principle, did accept a modest stipend that allowed him to pay the landlord and to buy a winter coat with a collar that did not thread. He accepted, too, an offer to meet with Fiona and a social worker to help design the liaison role. They met at the community center over steaming cups of coffee and in a room whose paint had yellowed from sun. He surprised himself by enjoying the meetings. He had ideas that sounded simple but felt revolutionary in their dignity. A phone number staff could call at any hour, a small fund that required no moral judgment to access, a rotation of administrators who would actually walk the hallways and see the work being done, not only the polished ceremonies. "You could call it the Visible Hands Liaison," Fiona suggested, a small smile stealing across her face at the aptness of the phrase. Bernard chuckled, a sound that took the edge off confrontation. "If it helps someone not get pushed out when they help, I'll take the name." He became a part-time advisor to the new program. The role was not a handout, and it did not carry a heavy title. It did carry value: his voice at a table, his hands guiding policy conversations, his presence a continuing argument against the invisibility of labor. Not every person who had nodded at the panel changed overnight. There were parents who clung to nervousness and donors who privately questioned the wisdom of making waves. Tyler continued to fume, but his influence waned as trustees listened to documented cases of staff mistreatment. When an internal review found that several incidents had been handled poorly and recommended personnel changes, the board accepted the recommendations. Tyler was asked to step back from direct oversight of donor affairs until a formal review could be completed. He would later be reassigned to an advisory role. His parking spot went from prime to ordinary. He complained, and some of his allies complained, but the school moved on because Alexandra could and would. The media narrative shifted slowly. The first local pieces had been sensational and quick. Later profiles were longer and quieter. A human interest story about a janitor who loved pancakes for his daughter, an op-ed about the invisibility of school staff, a piece on institutional reform in small schools. The clip that had been crafted to inflame drew far less traction than the uncut footage and the speeches that followed. People shared Bernard's words. Teachers wrote thank you notes. A teachers' union from a neighboring district reached out to Fiona asking about the program, and within months, representatives from other schools, a charter in a nearby borough and a private prep in the next county, came to Long Oak to listen and to learn. The Visible Hands Initiative found allies beyond the school grounds. A local foundation offered matching funds for the emergency stipend pool. A nonprofit that ran transitional housing partnered with the school to expand options beyond the small pilot. The program's early metrics were modest but hopeful: fewer short-term evictions among staff supported by the fund, quicker return to work times after emergencies, and a growing sense among staff that the institution was accountable. None of it solved structural poverty, none of it was perfect, but it made a measurable difference in the lives of the people who cleaned rooms and drove buses and kept the pipes from clogging. Bernard's life steadied in a way that made the ordinary things feel like achievements. He and Molly moved into a slightly larger apartment that had bright windows and a shelf where Molly stacked drawings.
Bernard took a small shared office at the school once a week to meet with staff and to gather stories of everyday indignities that needed fixing. He insisted on meeting for coffee with janitors who worked the late shifts. He learned names he had never before known. He helped design a form for anonymous complaints so workers could report problems without fear of immediate reprisal. He also returned to work in a way that felt different, not simply as a man who cleaned, but as someone whose work had been recognized. The morning his name was put back on the schedule, he stood in the supply closet and exhaled like a man who had been given air. He took the mop and the bucket and did not feel diminished by them. He felt whole. Molly thrived. The school offered her a scholarship to a summer enrichment program and free tutoring that made her cheeks flush with pride. The neighbor who had once crossed the street now stopped with a cup of lemonade and apologized with the simplicity of a neighbor who had ached to make amends. Janet, who had propped up both of them with casseroles and blunt counsel, watched them with a pleased stare. "You see," she said one morning, handing Bernard a mug, "you see how stubborn the good that you do is." Bernard's speech at the annual school assembly, where he was asked to speak about the program, was the public apex of the story, but not the end. He did not deliver platitudes.
Instead, he told the truth as simply as he could. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about the hands that tidy the rooms where our children learn, about the people who pick up after long days so others can have clean spaces. Visibility isn't charity, it's basic justice. If we can make rules where workers have dignity, then maybe we will raise children who see labor as love, not as something to step around." The auditorium rose in a wave of sound when he finished. Parents wiped their faces, teachers clapped. Some trustees stood stiffly and then joined in. Fiona watched from the back, her eyes wet and steady. Alexandra watched with a small, private satisfaction that was not triumphant, but relieved. The thing she had moved, some policies, some money, some accountability, was changing the way a place breathed. The Visible Hands Initiative, after a year, produced its first annual report, which Alexandra made public. It listed the number of individuals helped, the hours of emergency leave paid, and a modest set of recommendations for other schools considering similar programs. It also documented failed attempts and places where institutional resistance remained thick as old varnish. Alexandra shared those too. Transparency, she argued, was part of accountability. Tyler, whose presence receded into a narrower orbit, was not publicly demonized. The story was about a system that chose convenience over people. Tyler had been its most visible artifact. The school did not need caricatures, it needed repair. Some staff left, some were disciplined, and replacements were hired with an eye towards empathy and oversight. Hiring committees included staff-elected members. HR reorganized to include a whistleblower procedure that did not require a lawyer to be heard. Little things changed. The night custodian's schedule had a better rhythm. Supplies were ordered so that workers would not have to pay for their own gloves. Staff could request emergency cash without a procession of approvals. Each policy change was small, practical, and real. Months later, when a reporter asked Bernard whether he felt vindicated, he shrugged and smiled in a way that was neither brittle nor boastful. "Vindication is a strange word," he said. "I feel visible. That's enough most days. When Molly no longer has to count coins, and when I can go to the store and buy milk without someone stoning me with their eyes, I'll feel like we've done something." The ripple went further than the school. A neighboring district copied the staff liaison concept. A small coalition of donors formed a network to support staff emergency funds in private schools throughout the region. Local policymakers paid attention to the metrics and set up a roundtable where school leaders could discuss replicable solutions. The most private moment of the entire chapter came on a morning when Bernard made pancakes for Molly. The batter hissed in the skillet, sunlight pooled across the countertop.
Molly stood on a stool and stirred with solemn concentration, her tongue caught in the corner of her mouth. Bernard flipped a pancake and it flew a little, landing imperfectly but whole on the plate. They ate in comfortable silence, a rhythm made by practice. The apartment was not perfect. The windows were slightly fogged at the corners. But Molly laughed over a syrup spill and wiped her chin with a napkin. Later, she would go to a class filled with supplies Bernard could not have afforded last year. Later, he would sit at his small desk at the school and read a note from a worker, thanking the program for saving her from losing her home. Those were the moments that tasted like victory. At a ceremony marking the first year of the Visible Hands Initiative, Alexandra stood and read a short statement. She did not take much of the glory. She spoke of error and of correction. She spoke of a school that had done right. She announced a matching grant to expand the program and a commitment to convene other donors to do the same. In the audience, Bernard sat near the front, his jacket functional and his posture open. When Alexandra mentioned his name, he blushed as if someone had complimented a craft he never expected to be admired for. After the ceremony, parents and staff clustered around them. A woman held out a folded note expressing thanks. A former trustee came up and clasped Bernard's hand,
as if to say, "We all failed you, and here is a pledge to do better." The scene was imperfect and human. Some people were moved and others were cautious, but the school's atmosphere felt changed. The final visible shift was small but emblematic. The custodial staff asked for a modest plaque to hang in the maintenance room, not a donor wall, nothing that glittered for centuries, but a simple, weathered plank with the words "Visible Hands" carved into it. They hung it above the tool sink where mops were stored. It was nothing to anyone who would not understand the gesture. To the people who worked there, it was everything. Bernard touched the carved letters with a fingertip that still bore a faint scar from a summer work accident long ago. He thought of the hands motif, the hands that saved, the hands that scrubbed, the hands that helped write the policy that would keep others from being shoved out. He felt the continuity of labor across all those hands, and the small dignity of the plank on the wall. On a clear morning months later, the local evening news ran an update, a soft, steady piece about institutional reforms and how a community had responded when a story refused to be simple. They interviewed Alexandra about philanthropy and accountability. They interviewed Bernard about the importance of being visible. Then, in the final frame, they lingered on Molly at recess, laughing with friends, her hair in uneven pigtails, her backpack bright and new. There were no miracles in the tidy sense, no cinematic windfalls that solved every problem overnight.
But there were concrete changes. Emergency funds that prevented evictions, policy shifts that made staff voices official, a small but growing culture in which the people who kept the school running were seen and heard. Bernard's life, wound tight with worry before, loosened in places. He still woke once in a while to sharp memories of being pushed out, but he also lived more mornings with pancakes and a sense that his work mattered. On a late afternoon, when the light through the classroom windows drew the dust into gold, Bernard stood in the small office the school had given him twice a week. He was writing notes for an upcoming staff meeting. He had a list of items, anonymous complaint forms to fine-tune, a schedule for liaison hours, a plan for an employee appreciation potluck. He rubbed his thumb over a line where he'd written, in careful block letters, "Respect." Molly popped her head in to show him a drawing of the visible hands plaque, sketched in crayons with exaggerated letters. "Is that ours?" she asked. Bernard smiled and took the paper. "Yeah," he said, "that's ours." He looked at his hands, the same hands that had pressed against Alexandra's chest months ago, hands that had washed dishes and polished trophies, and now sketched policy ideas on a notepad. He could still feel the pressure of that night in his chest, the urgent, animal mastery of keeping someone alive. That memory had once become a weapon against him, and now it was a bridge. He liked the bridge. Some stories end by returning the world to a neat place. Long Oak's story did not become neat. It became insistently human, messier, slower, better. People learned that institutions are made of people who act and people who watch, that donors could exercise power with humility, and that visibility for workers is not a favor, but an obligation. Bernard walked Molly to the corner one morning as a bus rolled by, the children swinging backpacks. He put his arm around her and felt the easy rhythm of being a father, not simply a man in the background. He had an office chair that rolled and a stack of forms he was proud to sign. He had the visible plaque in the maintenance room and a daughter who ate pancakes without counting the cost. He was, in the truest sense, home. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more human stories that remind us what dignity looks like.